I stood before the full-length mirror, adjusting the delicate gold thread that ran through the navy silk of my borrowed dress, and felt the familiar, crushing weight of inadequacy settle heavily onto my shoulders. The dress, a loan from a designer friend who thankfully didn't charge based on the anxiety it induced, felt less like an elegant garment and more like a restrictive costume for a role I was profoundly unsuited to play. My own closet, stocked primarily with sensible separates and high-quality, practical fabric suitable for a freelance financial consultant, felt a world away from the gilded cage I was about to enter. The grand opening of my mother-in-law Victoria Harrington's new $50 million estate in Beverly Hills. I traced the faint scar on my wrist, a relic from a clumsy childhood bike accident, and wondered if such small flaws were as obvious to the guests as they were to me. The air in our modestly luxurious, but undeniably smaller, Brentwood condo was thick with the scent of lilies, a bouquet Liam, my husband, had purchased but not gifted with any particular warmth, seemingly just a necessary luxury item to tick off his pre-party checklist. He was already downstairs, restless and edgy, his tuxedo fitting him like a second skin, a uniform he had been born to wear, unlike me, who felt perpetually dressed in someone else's expensive hand-me-downs, metaphorically speaking. I knew this evening wasn't about celebrating a new home, it was about solidifying Victoria's place at the pinnacle of the Los Angeles social hierarchy, a place where I, Ilara Maxwell Harrington, a girl who grew up budgeting for university textbooks, was perpetually deemed a foreign, unwelcome body. I thought back to the conversation we'd had just yesterday, a conversation that had quickly devolved into one of our increasingly common, circular arguments about appearances and expectations. Liam, usually charming and laid back, transforms into a tense, irritable stranger when his mother is involved, a puppet dancing to the tune of her meticulously maintained disapproval. He'd emphasized, almost threatened, that I needed to be on my best behavior, a phrase that grated on me because it implied my normal behavior was somehow inherently shameful, a potential landmine waiting to ruin his precious evening. He didn't understand that for me, showing up was the best behavior I could manage. My breath hitched as I remembered the last time Victoria had hosted a large gathering, a New Year's Eve gala where she had openly, though cloaked in a velvet layer of concern, questioned my choice of career, suggesting it was cute, but lacked the necessary gravitas to be a suitable partner for a Harrington heir. I had swallowed my pride then, offering a forced smile, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a final, decisive battle, and I was stepping onto the battlefield with nothing but a borrowed dress and a rapidly depleting reservoir of self-control. I ran my hands over the cool fabric of the dress, noting how the silk seemed to absorb the light, drawing attention rather than deflecting it, which was precisely what Victoria would despise. The silence of the upstairs hallway, broken only by the insistent ticking of an antique grandfather clock Liam's father had passed down, magnified my inner turmoil. I closed my eyes and focused on the facts. I was successful, I loved Liam, or the man he was when his mother wasn't around, and I had earned my place beside him, even if Victoria believed otherwise. Yet, the self-doubt, a persistent, insidious whisper, reminded me of the numerous small rejections, the excluded trips, the delayed introductions to important contacts, the constant feeling of being an accessory rather than a partner. It was a suffocating environment, one I was beginning to realize was slowly poisoning my spirit, eroding the confident woman I used to be before I married into the Harrington name. I applied a final layer of lipstick, a vibrant berry shade that was maybe a bit too bold for a Harrington wife, but I chose it deliberately, an act of small rebellion against the monochrome elegance Victoria favored. It was a visible defiance, a way of signaling that Ilara was still present, buried beneath the required sophistication. I promised myself that if I was going to be publicly crucified, I would at least choose my own color palette for the execution. The thought brought a small, grim smile to my face, a fleeting moment of strength before the descent. I knew Liam was waiting. His impatience was a tangible entity, vibrating through the floorboards. The longer I delayed, the more agitated he would become, and the less likely he would be to offer even a fraction of support when the inevitable confrontation arrived. I took one last, deep breath, visualizing the evening as a professional obligation, a meeting I had to navigate, a financial risk I had to manage, detaching my emotions from the upcoming social carnage. It was the only way I knew how to survive in the shark-infested waters of his family's world, treating my marriage less like a union of souls and more like a high-stakes, extremely long-term investment. I paused at the top of the sweeping, curved staircase that led down to the foyer, noticing how the evening sun caught the diamond studs in my ears, again, borrowed, but sparkling brightly all the same. I gripped the banister, the polished mahogany cool beneath my fingers, and mentally braced myself for the performance. This was the moment of no return. I descended slowly, the tapping of my heels against the marble an announcement of my presence, a sound that felt deafeningly loud in the sudden hush of the house. I could see Liam at the bottom, his back to me, talking animatedly on his phone, already mentally miles away, lost in the privileged vortex of his own concerns. When he finally hung up and turned, his eyes briefly scanned my dress, not lingering on my face, before offering a curt nod. "You look fine," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth, already preoccupied. "Try not to wander off or get into any of Mother's crosshairs tonight. The mayor is here, and this needs to go smoothly." The comment was a punch to the gut, a swift reminder that my value tonight was purely cautionary, a potential liability to be managed, not a cherished partner to be proudly presented. His casual cruelty was becoming increasingly difficult to excuse, even under the stress of his mother's omnipresent influence. I forced the smile, the professional one, the one that masked deep-seated pain and resentment. "Duly noted, Liam. I'll stick to the champagne and minimal conversation," I replied, the sarcasm in my voice probably too sharp, but I didn't care to retract it. He didn't even catch the tone, already reaching for my elbow with a tight, proprietary grip, guiding me towards the door as if I were a valuable, fragile vase that needed careful escorting. We stepped out into the twilight, the warm California air thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant hum of traffic, heading toward a night that I knew, with a sinking certainty, would end in disaster, a disaster I was beginning to suspect I secretly wished for, just to finally break free. The limousine pulled up to the curb with an almost surgical precision, its dark, tinted windows offering a brief, illusory shield from the outside world before we were forced to step out into the glaring spotlights of the society pages. Liam rushed me in, barely holding the door before sliding in after me, his focus entirely on his phone again, quickly sending out last-minute, urgent texts. I settled into the plush leather seat, feeling the engine rumble beneath me, the sensation less like a journey and more like being strapped into a very expensive rocket aimed directly at the heart of my discomfort, an event I desperately wished to avoid. I stared out the window, watching the familiar, sun-drenched streets of Los Angeles blur past, and wondered, for the thousandth time, what I was doing here, married to a man who loved the idea of me, the smart, independent woman who made him look good, more than he loved the actual, complex, flawed me. The woman in the mirror, in the borrowed gold-threaded gown, was a ghost of myself, a beautiful shell devoid of the spirit I once possessed. This mansion opening, I knew, was where the ghost would either be laid to rest, or the real Alara would finally rise up and fight for her life back. It felt like the perfect storm was gathering. As the car turned onto the main avenue leading to the Harrington estate, the magnitude of the wealth and pretension we were about to face hit me with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The houses here weren't just large, they were fortress-like monuments to obscene prosperity, and Victoria's new creation, the Zenith, was rumored to be the crown jewel, a sprawling temple of marble and glass. I adjusted my posture, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to face the music, the silent soundtrack of my impending humiliation already playing in my head. The anticipation of the social scrutiny, the relentless, cold gaze of Victoria's friends and peers, felt worse than any professional audit I had ever conducted. At least in finance, the numbers don't lie, and they certainly don't judge your choice of handbag or your family's lack of a trust fund. Here, everything was subjective, based on an unwritten, ever-changing code of conduct that I had never managed to fully decipher, and frankly, was growing tired of trying to learn. Liam finally put his phone down and offered me a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ready for the circus?" he asked, not waiting for my answer, his gaze already fixed on the headlights of the cars ahead of us. The moment the limousine glided to a stop beneath the mansion's towering, illuminated portico, I felt the immediate, overwhelming theatricality of the event. Valets in crisp uniforms moved with balletic precision, guiding Rolls-Royces and Ferraris into their assigned, unseen parking spots, a synchronized display of elite service that managed to make even arriving feel like a competitive sport. Above us, the mansion, aptly named the Zenith, truly did look like the peak of something, perhaps peak ostentation, a sprawling, modern monolith of white marble, glass, and dramatic cantilevered terraces that defied gravity and good taste in equal measure. Every shrub was manicured, every light perfectly angled to highlight the impossible scale of Victoria's latest architectural triumph. Liam's grip on my elbow tightened possessively the moment we stepped out, less a gesture of affection and more a public declaration that I belonged to him, a valuable, if slightly volatile, asset. The flashbulbs popped immediately, the sound like a swarm of angry cicadas, momentarily blinding me. I instinctively shrunk back, but Liam tugged me forward, forcing me to meet the glare, whispering through a fixed, dazzling smile, "Eyes up, Ilara. They're here for the Harringtons." The phrase underscored the reality. They were here for the Harringtons, and I was merely a plus one, a decorative attachment to the main attraction. The air was already buzzing with the low, constant drone of expensive chatter, a symphony of polite facades and calculated flattery, punctuated by the clinking of crystal glasses. The foyer we entered was 3 stories high, featuring a dramatic, curving staircase, the kind you see in old Hollywood movies, and a ceiling mural that looked suspiciously like a contemporary interpretation of the Sistine Chapel, clearly commissioned to impress. Beneath this absurd dome, guests shimmered in designer gowns and bespoke suits, a sea of perfectly tailored wealth and effortless elegance that made my borrowed dress feel suddenly cheap and obvious, despite its expense. We moved through the crowd slowly, Liam pausing every few steps to exchange air kisses and handshakes with people whose names I couldn't keep straight. Venture capitalists, minor politicians, and an unsettling number of perfectly preserved socialites who seemed to subsist entirely on filtered water and Botox. I offered my practiced, neutral smile, the one that communicated friendliness without inviting deeper conversation, a strategy one had perfected over the years of navigating this foreign landscape. Each forced interaction was a reminder of the chasm between my reality and theirs. They spoke of summer homes in Capri and private jets while I was mentally calculating the optimal time to file my quarterly taxes. Liam, meanwhile, was in his element. He was charming, effusive, and entirely transformed from the stressed man in our condo. He belonged here, effortlessly gliding between powerful groups, his laughter a little too loud, his shoulders a little too broad, soaking up the validation that came with being Victoria's son. I watched him from the periphery, feeling a sudden, acute loneliness that was far sharper than being physically alone. Being ignored while standing right next to the person you love is a uniquely painful form of isolation, a clear signal of where you truly rank in their priorities. I excused myself from a particularly tedious conversation about the relative merits of different Swiss finishing schools, a topic I had absolutely nothing to contribute to, and headed towards a less crowded corner near a massive, floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering lights of the city. The view was breathtaking, a sea of diamonds stretching out to the horizon, but even this spectacular vista felt proprietary, possessed, and intimidating. I took a deliberate, slow sip of the crisp champagne, trying to anchor myself in the moment, reminding myself that the anxiety was temporary, the party finite. Just as I started to feel a flicker of peace, a familiar, predatory voice cut through the background noise like a sonic boom. "Ilara, darling. Are you hiding from the photographers? Such a shame, you actually look quite presentable tonight." Victoria Harrington materialized beside me, a vision of icy perfection in a shimmering platinum gown, her face a mask of perpetually displeased beauty, fixed in an expression of arch disapproval. She didn't wait for a response, her eyes already raking over my outfit, her expression broadcasting her inevitable finding, inadequacy. She leaned in conspiratorially, the scent of expensive perfume and cold malice washing over me. I hope you remembered what Liam told you. Tonight is crucial. We have several investors here, and honestly, we can't afford any distractions. The word distractions hung in the air, heavy with implication, clearly referring to me and any perceived cultural, social, or economic differences that might expose the slight crack in the Harrington facade, the one I represented. Her tone was dismissive, treating me less like a daughter-in-law and more like a barely tolerated staff member who might break the expensive china. I straightened up, meeting her gaze with a resolve I didn't entirely feel. I understand, Victoria. I'm simply admiring the incredible view. It's certainly grand, I replied, carefully choosing an adjective that was complimentary but also subtly hinted at the sheer excess of the place. She narrowed her eyes slightly, recognizing the slight pushback in my tone, but chose not to engage, instead pivoting to a more direct form of aggression that only she could execute with such practiced elegance. Speaking of grand, she continued, her voice suddenly louder, catching the attention of a passing group. Liam tells me you've decided to keep your little consulting business going. While I admire the initiative, dear, perhaps tonight wasn't the night to hand out business cards. It looks a little desperate, don't you think? Like you're poaching our guests. Her comment was based on a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was designed for maximum public damage, planted perfectly to imply impropriety right in front of the mayor's wife who was now standing nearby. My cheeks flushed scarlet. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to state clearly that I hadn't even brought a purse, let alone business cards, but Victoria continued her onslaught, not allowing me a foothold to speak. She was a master of the social ambush, and I realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't an offhand comment. It was the planned beginning of my systematic, public demolition, a calculated move to establish dominance in her new domain. She had chosen this moment, this place, and this specific, fragile audience to execute her social assassination of my reputation within their circle. I searched the room frantically for Liam, needing him, not just for protection, but as a witness to his mother's cruelty, hoping the sight would finally shock him out of his filial blindness. I spotted him across the immense ballroom, holding court with a group of important-looking men, laughing brightly, his back entirely turned towards the corner where his wife was being filleted alive by his mother. He looked utterly carefree, oblivious, and completely out of reach, solidifying the bitter truth that he was, and always would be, his mother's son first, my husband's second, if at all. Victoria, seeing the direction of my desperate gaze, gave a small, triumphant smile that didn't touch her eyes, confirming that she was fully aware of Liam's absence and that this was the moment she had been waiting for. I clenched my fists beneath the silk, the gold thread now feeling like actual chains, and tried to find the words to respond with dignity, to somehow parry her cruel thrust without descending to her level of petty malice. But before I could formulate a single syllable, the next, most devastating part of her attack was unleashed, one that would change the course of my marriage forever. Victoria seized a nearby empty champagne flute from a passing waiter, holding it aloft as if preparing to make a toast, effectively silencing the small group that had gathered near us. The momentary quiet felt suffocating, all eyes, including those of the mayor's wife, now fixed on our corner. This was no longer a private conversation. It was a performance, a deliberate spectacle designed to humiliate me on the grandest stage possible. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm that I was sure everyone could hear over the soft, classical music piped through the mansion's state-of-the-art sound system. She lowered the glass slightly, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that still somehow carried with perfect clarity across the silent pocket of the room. The thing is, Ilara, we Harringtons have a certain standard. A legacy to uphold. She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes boring into mine, daring me to interrupt, which I, frozen in shock, could not do. And when Liam decided to renovate our old family cottage, the one he promised me he'd turn into a charming guest house, the blueprints were altered. The foundation, the garden plans, everything. It's a mess, an absolute structural eyesore now. And guess who conveniently took over the oversight of the budget and the contracts right when the plans were secretly changed? Before I could process the gravity of the accusation, that I had secretly commandeered a family project and ruined it, Victoria delivered the poison dart. She claims it was sound financial management, but it looks an awful lot like a selfish grab for control, a deliberate effort to erase my influence on the property. The lie was audacious, designed not just to impugn my professional integrity, but to paint me as a malicious usurper, intent on dividing the family assets and turning Liam against his mother. The murmurs of the surrounding guests grew louder, the damage already done, the judgment in their eyes clear and immediate. The truth was, I had merely advised Liam, at his request, to restructure the project's financing after discovering a massive oversight in the initial contract that would have doubled the cost and left the old cottage structurally unsound, a fact I had clearly documented and sent to him. But Victoria's version twisted this fact into an act of sabotage, a narrative that suited her agenda perfectly. Ilara, the ambitious outsider, destroying family tradition for profit. I finally found my voice, laced with sharp, cold anger. That is absolutely untrue, Victoria. I saved Liam $500,000 by identifying the architectural flaw in the original foundation contract. I have the emails and the revised blueprints to prove it. I was helping too. Victoria didn't let me finish. She dramatically cut me off, her voice soaring to a volume that commanded the attention of the entire nearby cluster, including a group that Liam was now quickly extricating himself from, finally noticing the catastrophe unfolding. Helping? Oh, no, darling. Your help is exactly what we don't need. Her face, usually so composed, contorted into a brief, chilling flash of pure, unadulterated hatred. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest, her final, lethal declaration ringing out over the sudden silence of the crowd. My mom doesn't want you here, Ilara. The words hung in the air, blunt, brutal, and utterly final, a public expulsion issued from the mouth of the matriarch on the night of her triumph. The collective gasp from the surrounding guests was deafening, the kind of moment that people would recount in hushed tones for months in this closed circle. All the air seemed to rush out of the cavernous foyer, leaving me stranded, exposed, and trembling with a cocktail of shock and incandescent rage. I stood there, reeling from the force of her public shaming, feeling the hot flush of humiliation creeping up my neck. Then, the final hammer blow landed. Liam, his face pale with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, finally reached our side, but his concern wasn't for me. It was for the smooth functioning of his mother's spectacle. He didn't look at me, he looked only at Victoria, offering a placating, weak smile. Mother, please, the mayor's here. We can discuss this later. He then turned, his expression hardening, his eyes finally meeting mine, but they held only cold fury, not protection. He didn't defend me. He didn't contradict his mother's lie. He chose his side, instantly and irrevocably, confirming my worst fears about his loyalty and his character. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my silk-covered skin, a painful grip that was far from a tender touch. Ilara, just stop, he hissed through clenched teeth, leaning down so only I could hear the venom in his whisper. You've made a scene. That's enough. Why must you always make things so difficult? Mother is upset, and frankly, you should have just left the cottage alone. You're being melodramatic. He then added the words that completely shattered the fragile remnants of my marriage, publicly cementing his betrayal and casting the final stone against me. You're embarrassing me, Ilara. Go home. Now. I'll deal with you later. The shame was absolute, complete, and crushing. The public dismissal, the immediate siding with his mother's lie, and the casual contempt in his voice, it was all too much. I felt the sharp sting of tears, but I refused to let them fall, refusing to give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I pulled my arm sharply out of his grasp, the sudden motion causing the gold thread in my dress to catch the light one last time, a final, dramatic shimmer before my exit. I looked Liam directly in the eye, and the look I gave him was devoid of love, of pity, of anything but icy, final resolution. I didn't utter a word. There was nothing left to say to a man who had just prioritized his mother's pride and his own social standing over his wife's dignity. I turned my back on him, on Victoria, and on the entire glittering, suffocating nightmare of the zenith, the sound of the guests' whispers fading into a dull roar behind me as I walked, head held high, towards the magnificent, ridiculous front door. I walked past the shocked valets, past the photographers who eagerly captured my desolate walk of shame, and flagged down the first available black car, throwing my dignity into the wind and my wedding vows onto the polished marble floor of the foyer. The drive home would be the last journey I would ever take as Mrs. Liam Harrington. The interior of the Uber black I hailed felt like a tomb of silence and anonymity, a stark contrast to the overwhelming noise and scrutiny of Victoria's mansion. I sank into the back seat, physically shaking, but the tremor was slowly morphing from one of panic into one of cold, controlled fury. The driver, thankfully, was silent, respecting the palpable tension radiating from my corner of the car, and merely drove, navigating the winding, hillside roads that separated the world of the obscenely rich from the slightly less obscenely rich Brentwood neighborhood where Liam and I shared a life that now felt like a complete, beautifully furnished lie. I looked down at my hands, still slightly trembling, and realized the borrowed gold-threaded dress was wrinkled where Liam's hand had crushed my arm, a physical imprint of his betrayal. The shame he inflicted was a raw, burning wound, but beneath the immediate pain, a steel-like resolution was forming, hardening my core. Go home. I'll deal with you later. His words echoed in my mind, not as a threat, but as an epitaph for our 3-year marriage. He had reduced me to an errant child, a problem to be solved after the important guests had left, an embarrassing complication to his perfect evening. The realization was liberating in its finality. I reached for my phone, my fingers flying across the screen with a speed that belied my inner turmoil. I didn't call a friend or a lawyer. I opened my banking app, then my investment portfolio, and finally, the secure folder containing our shared financial documents. I didn't want to leave him ruined, but I needed to ensure my own financial independence was immediate and absolute. I transferred the last of my liquid assets out of our joint accounts and into my personal, untraceable investment vehicle, a small, necessary act of self-preservation that felt incredibly empowering. The numbers didn't judge, they just moved, cleanly and efficiently, reflecting the sudden, clean break I was making from his life. I stared out the window at the glittering expanse of Los Angeles, the city that promised dreams and delivered only cold reality, and let the flashbacks flood my mind, not of our wedding day, but of the numerous small indignities that had preceded tonight. The time he corrected my pronunciation of a French wine in front of his friends, the countless instances he failed to introduce me as his wife, instead offering the vague "this is Alara," the patronizing tone he adopted whenever I discussed my business, implying it was a hobby rather than a successful, profitable venture. Tonight hadn't been an isolated incident, it was the inevitable climax of years of neglect, manipulation, and covert emotional abuse, all orchestrated by his desire to appease his demanding mother. I remembered the cottage project he had mentioned. He had come to me, frantic, months ago, after realizing the original plans Victoria had pushed through were financially irresponsible and structurally dangerous. I had spent weeks discreetly restructuring the project, saving him the embarrassment of admitting the flaw to his mother while simultaneously preventing a massive financial loss. My reward? Being publicly shamed and accused of sabotage, not just by Victoria, but by Liam himself, who, knowing the truth, had stood by and watched me burn, prioritizing the illusion of peace over the reality of my loyalty. He chose his mother's approval over my entire worth. The car descended into the familiar, tree-lined streets of Brentwood. I directed the driver to drop me a block away from our condo, needing a final moment of contemplation and space before facing the silent, empty rooms that held the memories of a life that was now definitively over. I paid the driver, adding an exorbitant tip for his silence and discretion, and stepped out onto the cool pavement, the sudden shift in temperature a welcome change from the heated intensity of the mansion. The gold-threaded dress felt alien and heavy, a symbol of the lie I had been living, and I couldn't wait to shed it. Walking that final block was the hardest walk of my life. Each step was a farewell to the future I had envisioned, the quiet evenings, the travel plans, the hope that one day, Liam would finally stand up for me, for us. That hope, I realized, was dead, killed tonight by his own words. I reached the front door of our condo, inserted the key into the lock, and stepped inside, the familiar scent of lilies and mahogany instantly reminding me of the life I was about to dismantle. The house was exactly as we had left it, peaceful and orderly, a silent witness to the chaos that had just erupted miles away. I headed straight for the shared bedroom, moving with a calm, surgical precision. I opened Liam's side of the walk-in closet, pulling out a large, empty suitcase. I didn't hesitate. I began to pack only my things. The clothes, the books, the photo albums, the financial documents I knew he would try to access later, leaving his world untouched. I was not fleeing, I was simply extracting myself from a toxic environment, moving out quietly and decisively before the morning light revealed the true extent of the wreckage. I packed with an almost clinical detachment, the only sound the soft click of hangers and the whisper of fabric against leather. The process took less than an hour. I was a practical person, and I had always known, deep down, that this day might come. I left the gold-threaded dress lying crumpled on the bed, a final, silent indictment, no longer a borrowed gown but a discarded costume. I looked around the room one last time, at the expensive art and the customized furniture, none of which truly reflected my taste, and felt nothing but profound relief. I was leaving the prison of perfection, and the freedom felt immediate and exhilarating, even amidst the deep, residual pain. I hauled the heavy suitcase downstairs, positioning it near the door, ready for a swift, final exit when the time came. I then sat down in the quiet living room, the city lights streaming through the panoramic windows, and pulled out my laptop. I wasn't waiting for Liam. I was preparing my final move. The shame he had inflicted was a debt, and I intended to collect, not with vengeance, but with the cold, unassailable logic of the financial world he respected so much. I opened a new document, the title blazing across the screen, Proposal for Immediate Marital Dissolution and Asset Division. My moment of power had arrived. Back at the Zenith, the party was still in full, blinding swing, but for Liam Harrington, the music had suddenly gone sour. After Alara's icy, silent departure, he had returned to his guests, his veneer of confident charm slightly chipped. He plastered the smile back on, continuing the conversation with the mayor and a major European investor, but the words felt hollow, and his concentration kept slipping. He kept glancing towards the massive front doors, half expecting Alara to reappear, perhaps to apologize, or maybe even to make another, more dramatic scene, just to test his rapidly depleting patience. Victoria, ever the predator, approached him moments later, a victorious, self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. That was handled well, Liam. A necessary move. She needed to be reminded of her place, especially with the mayor's wife listening. We can't have her discussing that tacky cottage financing. It would make us look disorganized, she whispered, patting his arm with a proprietary squeeze that felt, for the first time, not comforting, but suffocating. Liam nodded woodenly, accepting the compliment, but the relief he expected to feel never arrived. Instead, a faint, nauseating churn of guilt began to twist in his stomach, a sensation he hadn't anticipated. He told himself he had done the right thing, the necessary thing, to protect the family name and his mother's critical event. Ilara had been difficult, and she had drawn attention. But the memory of her face, the way her eyes had been completely dead, empty of all the warmth and life he usually relied on, pricked his conscience. He recalled the sheer, unadulterated coldness of her final look, a look that spoke volumes of finality, and he suddenly felt a nervous knot tightening in his chest. He dismissed it as party stress, blaming Ilara for making him feel this way. The evening dragged on, a monotonous repetition of forced compliments and vapid small talk. Liam found himself increasingly distracted, unable to focus on the investor's rambling explanation of global finance. He kept replaying the scene, Victoria's vicious accusation, Ilara's brief, sharp defense, and his own, brutal command to go home. He realized he had never seen her so pale, so quiet, and he hadn't even stopped to ask for her side, simply defaulting to his mother's manufactured outrage. It was a pattern he hated but constantly repeated, an automatic reflex born from 20 years of conditioning. Then, the true catalyst for his regret arrived, not from his heart, but from his wallet. His phone buzzed urgently in his tuxedo pocket, a specific, encrypted alert from his private financial consultant, Mark. Liam excused himself hastily, feeling a sudden chill, and stepped into the nearest empty room, a lavish, custom-built library that smelled of new leather and unread books. He opened the text. The content was short, urgent, and immediately plunged him into a cold sweat that instantly erased the memory of the party's glamour. The message read, "Urgent. The Singapore deal, the escrow wire for the final $25 million was supposed to be executed 3 hours ago. I've checked the codes. The transfer has been rejected by the intermediary bank. They cited an immediate need for an updated KYC, Know Your Customer, compliance document, specifically, the complex international tax document with the newly updated signature protocols. We don't have this new document. Who handled the signature update and compliance filing? This is a serious hold-up." Liam's mind went blank. The Singapore deal was the keystone of his entire year, a complex, 9-figure transaction that was supposed to close tonight, providing the cash infusion he desperately needed to stabilize his own shaky, over-leveraged portfolio. The entire opening party, the showing off, the public display of wealth, it was all a smokescreen to project confidence while he waited for this massive wire transfer to land. The funds were now stuck, blocked by a single, missing piece of paperwork, a specialized document he had delegated months ago and then promptly forgotten about. He quickly sent a frantic text back to Mark, who was in charge of the KYC compliance for Singapore. "I thought my assistant." Mark's immediate reply was a sharp, digital reprimand. "Your assistant only handled the domestic filings. You specifically tasked Ilara with the international tax compliance and signature protocols after the new EU directive came out. She set up the secure filing system on your private server. She has the only access code and the only updated digital signature." The world tilted slightly. Ilara. The very woman he had just publicly humiliated, accused of sabotage, and dismissed like an unruly maid, held the single, non-negotiable key to the entire $25 million transaction. His mother's petty social triumph had inadvertently derailed his business empire. The guilt that was a tiny flicker moments ago instantly roared into a bonfire of self-reproach, a visceral, sickening understanding of the colossal mistake he had just made. The regret, sharp and cold, hit him not as a matter of emotion, but as a catastrophic financial reality. He frantically typed a message to Ilara. "Ilara, I need the code for the Singapore file. Urgent. Call me back." He sent the text, but his panic only intensified when he realized his folly. She was at home, alone, nursing a monumental humiliation that he had personally inflicted. What if she didn't answer? What if she simply deleted the message and went to sleep, leaving him stranded in a financial black hole? The mere thought of losing the deal, of the cascade of defaults and margin calls that would follow, made his knees weak. The zenith, his mother's pride, suddenly felt like a cage. He stumbled out of the library, the noise of the party suddenly assaulting him, transforming from sophisticated chatter to a deafening, judgmental roar. He saw Victoria across the room, smiling regally, unaware that the foundation of her son's prosperity was crumbling beneath her bespoke heels, all thanks to her need for control and his spineless inability to defend his wife. He realized the grotesque irony. He had shamed the most capable, organized, and financially prudent person he knew for the sake of a social drama she found beneath her, and now that capability was his only lifeline. He called Alara's cell phone. No answer. Straight to voicemail. He tried again. The same result. He began to pace, his perfectly tailored tuxedo suddenly feeling suffocatingly hot, realizing the depth of his isolation. He couldn't tell his mother. She would simply see it as another example of Alara's untrustworthiness, refusing to acknowledge her own role in the mess. He couldn't tell his financial partners. The confidence game would be over instantly. He was completely alone, trapped by his own pride and his disastrous priority choice. He needed Alara, not his mother, and he had just burned the bridge to her. Liam stood on one of the Zenith's pristine, glass balconies, the cool night air doing nothing to calm the fever of his panic. He had tried Alara's phone 3 more times, each attempt resulting in the same immediate jump to a polite, distant voicemail. The financial consultant, Mark, was now bombarding him with texts. Need the signature, Liam. This is time-sensitive. The banks closed the window at 11:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're losing crucial time. It was already past 8 p.m. Pacific Time. He had mere hours before the deal officially collapsed, taking his meticulously built financial scaffolding with it. He finally, weakly, approached his mother, feigning a casual air. Mother, have you seen Alara's purse? She left in a hurry. I think she might have accidentally left her smaller key fob here. He knew it was a ridiculous lie. Alara always carried the bare minimum. Victoria merely waved a dismissive hand, entirely wrapped up in entertaining a media mogul. Alara? Oh, darling, she's gone home. She was clearly overwhelmed by the caliber of the guests. Poor dear. You handled her departure perfectly. Stop worrying about that little issue and focus on Mr. Chen. Her casual cruelty, once a source of comfort, now felt like a punch in the gut. He couldn't tell her the truth. Victoria's solution would be to bluster, threaten the bank, and try to throw money at the problem, none of which would produce the necessary, specialized digital signature held by his wife. He needed Alara's specific, organized mind and the unique access she had created. The problem was not just the code. It was the trust he had shattered just an hour ago in front of 50 of the most important people in his social orbit. He had publicly declared her worthless, and now her worth was the only thing standing between him and financial disaster. Liam rushed back inside, his carefully constructed composure finally crumbling. He needed to be physically in front of her, to apologize, to beg, to use every charm tactic he knew, and he knew he had to get there now. He couldn't wait for the party to end. The clock was ticking, and the distance between the Zenith and his home suddenly felt like a transatlantic flight. He found his assistant, whispered a hurried, completely fabricated excuse about an urgent family emergency, and demanded his car be brought around immediately. As he waited for his Bentley to pull up, he began to realize the extent of his mistake. It wasn't just a missed business opportunity, it was a character flaw laid bare. He had constantly allowed his mother's narrative, that Alara was not one of them, that her business was trivial, that she was merely an outsider to be tolerated, to dictate his own behavior. He had been a weak, scared child seeking maternal validation, and in doing so, he had alienated the only person who genuinely had his back, the only person who constantly worked to protect him from his own family's hubris and mistakes. He remembered Alara's passionate defense regarding the cottage, and how he had dismissed her meticulous, documented facts as melodrama. The irony was suffocating. She had been doing exactly what was needed, protecting him from financial ruin, and he had let her be crucified for it. He pictured the documents he knew she would have compiled, perfectly organized, indexed, cross-referenced, and secured. His own files were a chaotic mess. He relied entirely on her organizational genius, a fact he had never once acknowledged, let alone appreciated. The car finally arrived, and Liam jumped into the driver's seat, ignoring the startled valet. He sped down the mansion's long, winding driveway, the glittering, triumphant lights of the zenith receding rapidly in his rearview mirror. The party, the guests, the mayor, they all suddenly meant nothing, dissolving into a shallow, meaningless pursuit compared to the very real threat of professional and financial ruin. He realized that the social acceptance he craved had come at the cost of his integrity and, possibly, his future. The drive was a blur of frantic speed and self-recrimination. He thought back to the way he had grabbed her arm, the harshness of his tone, the humiliating public dismissal. He had done precisely what he promised he never would. He had treated her like one of Victoria's disposable accessories. He wasn't just driving home to ask for a code. He was driving home to face the wreckage of his own making, the regret a sharp, burning acid in his throat. He had been a coward, and now he was paying the ultimate price. He reached for his phone again, debating calling his lawyer, but dismissed the idea instantly. A lawyer couldn't generate a digital signature. Only Alara could. He had to face her, humble himself, and hope that the smart, forgiving woman he married still existed beneath the cold mask he had forced her to wear. The thought terrified him, not because he was afraid of her anger, but because he was terrified of her complete indifference. He realized that indifference from Alara would be the most definitive indicator that his marriage was truly, irrevocably over, a fate he was suddenly desperate to avoid. Liam pulled his Bentley into the driveway of the Brentwood condo, the tires crunching on the gravel, the sound jarringly loud in the quiet, upscale neighborhood. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, the silence of the night pressing in on him. This was their home, the space they had decorated together, a compromise between his inherited taste and her practical elegance. Now, in the stark overhead glow of the street lamp, it looked utterly still, silent, and unfamiliar, like a stage set after the actors have departed. He grabbed his phone, seeing Mark's latest text. "Liam, we are 10 minutes from the cutoff on our side. Please tell me you have it." The renewed urgency propelled him out of the car. He rushed to the front door, fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them once onto the polished concrete porch. Finally, he managed to unlock the door and stepped inside, calling out, "Alara? Alara, are you here?" His voice echoed in the hallway, sounding hollow and desperate, a sound he had never heard himself make before. The house was eerily quiet. The scent of the lilies was still present, but now mixed with a faint, metallic odor of something gone stale. He moved quickly through the ground floor, the kitchen, the dining room, the living room, all immaculate, exactly as they had left it, except for a profound sense of emptiness, a stillness that felt heavier than simple absence. He noticed a faint smudge on the pristine white couch where he had carelessly placed his shoe this morning, a tiny detail that spoke of the chaos he usually left for her to silently manage. He raced up the stairs, taking the curved mahogany two at a time, his heart pounding in his ears. He burst into the primary bedroom, stopping dead in the doorway. The room was mostly normal, but one sight immediately snagged his attention. The gold-threaded dress, crumpled unceremoniously on the center of the white duvet, a discarded symbol of the night's trauma. Beside it, his own side of the bed was perfectly turned down, but her side was a mess, the pillows tossed, the sheets tangled, a sign of her frantic energy and distress, yet she was nowhere to be seen. He walked over to the closet, his panic intensifying. He flung open her side of the custom-built, his and hers walk-in. His clothes hung neatly, perfectly spaced. Her side was largely empty. The majority of her everyday, practical wardrobe was gone. The row of sensible shoes, the neat stack of sweaters, the familiar red leather briefcase, all gone. Only the items he had bought her, the purely ornamental, expensive jewelry, a few impractical gowns, things she rarely wore, remained a silent, damning judgment on his material gifts and her personal detachment from them. She hadn't just left the party, she had left him. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the gold dress crinkling beneath his weight, and buried his face in his hands, the full, devastating reality washing over him. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't a temporary storm. Ilara was gone. She had extracted herself, cleanly and completely, from the lie of their life. His cruelty had pushed her past the point of no return, and the chilling emptiness of the room was the echo of his monumental failure as a husband. His regret was no longer an intellectual, financial assessment. It was a deep, visceral pain, the terrifying loss of the one anchor he didn't realize he needed. He noticed a small, folded note placed conspicuously on his pillow, secured beneath a heavy antique paperweight he knew she despised. His hands trembled as he unfolded the crisp, expensive stationery. It wasn't an emotional screed, but a cold, concise business memo, written in her precise, elegant handwriting. The title at the top, underlined twice, was Status Report, Marriage, Contract HE09-2022. His stomach lurched. He read the few, brutal lines. Contract is in material breach, C. Public Humiliation Clause, Section 4.c. Assets liquidated for personal protection. Filed for immediate dissolution. Documentation is with my legal counsel. Do not attempt contact until you are prepared to discuss my non-negotiable professional terms. There was no signature, only a terse final line. Your $25 million Singapore compliance file and access codes are available under one condition. I will text you the location when you confirm you are ready to comply with my demands. Do not call. The note was a masterpiece of cold, professional finality, a rejection that cut deeper than any emotional outburst ever could. She had turned their marriage into a business transaction, and he was the one in breach of contract. The missing $25 million deal, now inextricably linked to his divorce, was no longer just a financial problem. It was the mechanism of his accountability, her carefully chosen instrument of power. His earlier shame now seemed trivial compared to the total, comprehensive destruction he faced. He was not only ruined financially, but he was also facing a humiliating divorce orchestrated by the same sharp mind he had so casually dismissed. Liam stood slowly, the crumpled note still clutched in his hand, feeling a strange mix of terror and grudging respect. Ilara hadn't just run away, she had orchestrated a strategic, calculated withdrawal, ensuring she held all the leverage. She knew him, she knew his priorities, and she had weaponized his immediate financial crisis as the key to her freedom and the basis of her demands. He was now on her timeline, subject to her terms, a position he had never before experienced in his privileged life. The power had shifted completely, and he was desperate, exposed, and entirely dependent on the person he had betrayed. He reread the note, focusing on the phrase, "Do not attempt contact until you are prepared to comply with my demands." He knew he had to comply. There was no alternative. The Singapore deal was the only thing preventing a chain reaction that would make Victoria's mansion party a footnote in the story of his spectacular ruin. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the dial icon, but he stopped himself, remembering her explicit instruction, "Do not call." He had to show he understood the gravity of the situation and the nature of the game she was now playing, a game of professional respect, not emotional reconciliation. He walked into the large, empty master bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and looked at his reflection in the mirror, a man in a $5,000 tuxedo, looking utterly defeated, his face gaunt with panic. He was a successful businessman, a Harrington heir, yet he was begging for a document from his wife who had just left him. The humiliation was profound, but he knew it was deserved. He took a deep, shaky breath, straightened his tie, and composed the only message he could send, the only one that would prove he was finally ready to accept her terms. To Ilara, "I received your note. I accept your terms. I understand the severity of the situation. I am prepared to comply with your non-negotiable professional demands. I am not calling. Please send the location for the Singapore compliance document. He typed the message, deleting and retyping it 3 times, ensuring the tone was entirely professional, devoid of any attempt at emotional manipulation or false apology. It was a business communication, a surrender document, and he had to sign it digitally. He waited. Every second felt like an hour. He paced the quiet rooms, the silence of the condo mocking his frantic energy. He checked his watch, 8:45 p.m. The cutoff was rapidly approaching. He imagined the conference room in Singapore, the lawyers waiting, the frustrated bank officials, and the entire edifice of his year's work hanging precariously on Alara's decision to respond. The regret was a constant, sharp throb, no longer focused on the money, but on the years of blindness and disrespect that had led him to this critical, terrifying moment. Finally, his phone buzzed. A single, cryptic text from Alara, sent from an untraceable number. Check the safe deposit box. Account #540B key is in the second drawer of the antique mahogany desk, beneath the stack of your grandfather's old financial ledgers. You will find a file marked contingency. That file contains the digital key, the access code, and the original, physical compliance document. Use the digital key now. We talk later. Do not fail. The wave of relief that crashed over him was so intense it almost brought him to his knees, a sudden, complete release of paralyzing pressure. She had done it. She had prepared a contingency plan, of course she had. She was too smart, too cautious, to leave a detail of that magnitude unmanaged, even in the heat of her exit. She had stored the key, not in their shared digital files, but in a physical safe deposit box that required a specific key she knew he had access to, but rarely used, a brilliant move that guaranteed the document's safety while simultaneously forcing him to follow her instructions precisely. He rushed to the mahogany desk, a heavy, intimidating piece of antique furniture that Victoria had gifted them, and pulled open the second drawer, the one he rarely touched. Sure enough, beneath the dusty stack of his grandfather's archaic ledgers, lay a small, tarnished silver key. He grabbed it, his fingers closing tightly around the cold metal, a feeling of hope finally rising above the despair. He knew that the crisis was momentarily averted, but the true reckoning, the emotional and marital one, was still waiting, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that it would be far more costly than $25 million. Armed with the key and a renewed sense of frantic purpose, Liam called Mark immediately, his voice hoarse but steady. "Mark, listen carefully. The documents are secure. I need you to dispatch a courier to the downtown branch immediately. The safe deposit box number is 540B. I'm leaving now to retrieve the physical file. The digital key for the escrow is in the file. I will text you the access code and the necessary digital signature upon retrieval." He rushed back down the stairs, grabbing his car keys and wallet, the discarded tuxedo now feeling like the heavy, expensive uniform of a defeated man. He looked at the crumpled gold-threaded dress one last time, a silent promise forming in his mind. He would not just apologize, he would acknowledge the true depth of his crime, the shaming, the disrespect, the years of complicity in his mother's abuse. He had to save the deal, but more importantly, he had to save the faint possibility of reconciliation with the woman he suddenly realized he couldn't live without. The drive downtown was a nerve-wracking blur of high-speed lane changes and desperate glances at his phone. The minutes were ticking away relentlessly, each one feeling like a massive, expensive penalty. He reached the bank just as the security guard was starting to lock the main doors. He stumbled in, breathless, flashing his ID and the secure access key card, demanding to be let into the vault area immediately. The manager, a quiet, older man who knew Liam's father well, looked at him with an expression of mild curiosity and deep-seated weariness. The process of accessing the safe deposit box felt agonizingly slow. The manager escorted him into the dimly lit, heavy-doored vault, a cool, silent space that seemed utterly divorced from the frantic pace of the outside world. The formality, the dual key turning ritual, the heavy clunk of the box sliding out, it all felt like a deliberate, torturous delay. Liam stood there, his tuxedo out of place in the functional setting, watching the time tick past, his entire future resting on a small metal box. Finally, he was alone in the private viewing room, the small box sitting on the table before him. He opened it, his hands shaking slightly. Inside, precisely as Alara had described, was a single, thick manila envelope marked contingency. He tore it open, pulling out a sheaf of meticulously organized documents, and there, on top, was a small, encrypted USB drive and a single page of instructions. The digital key and the access code were clearly labeled. He immediately sent a text to Mark, relaying the complex, multi-layered code and confirming the digital signature was ready for transfer. Code sent. Go now. Execute the wire transfer immediately. He then picked up the phone and made a call to a private investigator, giving the order with a cold, clear voice. I need surveillance on my mother, Victoria Harrington, and I need a full, comprehensive file on any and all financial dealings she has been involved in over the past 6 months, specifically any related to the Singapore deal or the foundation of the old cottage. Everything. Immediately. He was not just saving his money, he was preparing for war. As he drove back to the condo, a sense of icy calm settled over him, replacing the panic. The deal was saved. Mark had confirmed the wire transfer had been initiated and accepted just moments before the final cutoff. He was financially safe, for now. But the cost was still pending, the price of Alara's forgiveness and the total destruction of his relationship with his mother. He knew what he had to do. He had to choose his future, and for the first time in his life, he knew with absolute certainty that his future was with Alara, and standing up to Victoria was the price of entry. He returned to the empty condo, the quiet house now feeling less like a tomb and more like a courthouse where he was awaiting judgment. He looked at the gold-threaded dress again, seeing it not as an expensive garment, but as the final piece of evidence in the case against him, the symbol of the privilege and neglect he had used to justify his cruelty. He sat down on the living room couch, the emergency over, and waited, feeling the raw, heavy weight of his regret, knowing that the only thing that mattered now was proving to Alara that he was a man capable of repentance and change. Liam didn't have to wait long. Just as the clock struck 10:30 p.m., the front door of the condo opened and closed with a quiet, decisive click. Alara walked in, not dressed in the crumpled, gold-threaded gown, but in a simple, high-quality cashmere sweater and dark trousers, her hair pulled back into a severe, professional knot. She carried a small, empty travel mug, suggesting she had been sitting in a nearby coffee shop, waiting, strategically allowing him enough time to execute the transaction and understand the full gravity of his dependency on her. She looked utterly composed, cold, and beautiful in her controlled anger. She stopped in the middle of the living room, her eyes scanning the room, landing finally on him, sitting forlornly in his expensive, crumpled tuxedo. Her expression did not betray a single emotion, no pity, no anger, just a complete and total detachment that chilled him to the bone. She placed the mug on the nearest table, the soft clink of ceramic on wood the only sound in the vast, tense space. The wire went through, she stated flatly, not as a question, but as a confirmation of her own meticulous competence. Mark confirmed the funds are secured. Liam slowly rose, straightening his jacket, knowing that any display of weakness or emotional pleading would be instantly dismissed. This was a negotiation, and he had to approach it with the same respect and gravity she afforded her own professional dealings. Yes. It did, he replied, his voice rough. Thank you, Alara. You saved me from a catastrophic loss. I want you to know, he stopped himself. An apology was not what she wanted yet. She wanted facts, and she wanted accountability for the shaming she endured. Don't thank me, Liam, she interrupted, her voice low and even, cutting through his attempt at emotion. You accepted my terms. We are here now to discuss compliance. The money is leverage for my freedom and my reputation. Let's keep this efficient. She walked over to the desk, pulled out a notepad and pen, her own, he noticed, not the ones he bought her, and turned back to face him, the stance of a prosecutor ready to deliver the closing argument. You made a scene in front of the mayor, a major investor, and my mother, your wife, and your business partner. The humiliation was total. Now, you must pay the price for that breach of contract. Liam nodded, his gaze steady, acknowledging her command. I understand. I behaved appallingly. I prioritized my mother's warped sense of propriety and my own cowardice over your dignity and your professional integrity. I shamed you publicly, Ilara, knowing the truth about the Cottage Foundation and the Singapore compliance. There is no excuse. I am truly sorry, not just for the panic I felt, but for the pain I inflicted. It was unforgivable. He delivered the words with sincere gravity, not looking for pity, but for acceptance of his fault. Ilara's expression softened slightly, a flicker of pain crossing her eyes, but it vanished instantly, replaced by the steely resolve. Your apology is noted, Liam. But apologies are cheap. My demands are not. They are non-negotiable, and they address the core issue of why I left tonight. This isn't just about my embarrassment, it's about your public, chronic disrespect for my professional worth. She tapped the pen against her notepad, her eyes piercing him. I have 3 demands, and your compliance is due by the close of business tomorrow. Liam swallowed hard, the magnitude of her terms finally sinking in. He was not just buying back a file, he was buying back his future, and the price was his submission to her moral and professional authority. I'm listening, he said, taking a step closer, determined to show her he was ready to face whatever came next. He realized in that moment that this was the most honest, high-stakes conversation they had ever had, stripped of the pretense and performance that usually defined their life. The coldness was painful, but the truth was finally out in the open. Ilara began to speak, listing her demands with the precision of a CEO reading out a hostile takeover bid. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for debate or negotiation, each word a hammer driving home the nail of his failure. Liam listened intently, his expression unchanging, accepting the terms of his surrender, realizing that this was not the end, but the difficult, necessary beginning of a complete and total renegotiation of his entire life, both personal and professional. The woman before him was no longer his wife, she was his judge, jury, and, perhaps, his only path to redemption. Ilara set the pen down, the click echoing in the large room, and her eyes held his in an unwavering gaze, forcing him to confront the full severity of his actions. She wasn't negotiating a settlement, she was issuing an ultimatum, and he knew he had zero leverage to argue. These are not for discussion, Liam. They are the cost of my professional silence regarding the Singapore deal's near collapse, and the condition for my legal counsel delaying the dissolution filing. First, she began, her voice crisp and clear, you will issue a public, signed statement by 9 a.m. tomorrow. This statement will not be an apology to me, it will be a correction of the record. You will state that the contract changes to the cottage were your decision, based on a structural and financial flaw you personally identified, and that I, Ilara Maxwell Harrington, provided expert, unpaid consultancy that saved the project from imminent failure and significant financial loss. Liam nodded immediately, knowing this struck at the heart of Victoria's narrative and his own cowardice. Done. I will draft it now and have my assistant disseminate it through all our usual press channels first thing in the morning. It will also be posted prominently on your mother's personal website. The last part was a genuine act of defiance, a move he knew would infuriate Victoria, and he felt a small, necessary surge of self-respect for finally standing up to her. Second, Ilara continued, ignoring his addition, her focus entirely on her own terms. You will immediately, and permanently, terminate all financial and project oversight involvement your mother currently holds in any of your personal or professional ventures. This includes her advisory position on the Harrington Family Trust and any board position she holds related to the Singapore entity. She is corrosive to your financial stability and my professional reputation. You will execute this by end of day tomorrow, with signed legal documentation. This demand was the true bombshell, striking at the core of Liam's life structure, his dependence on, and fear of, his mother. This was not just severing a tie, it was declaring financial war on the most powerful person in his life. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the magnitude of the consequence flashing through his mind. Victoria would be furious, vengeful, and possibly unforgiving. But he looked at Elara, saw the steel in her spine, and realized the alternative, losing her and everything he had built, was far worse. I will instruct my counsel to begin the termination process first thing in the morning. I will personally deliver the papers. Good, she said, her voice finally holding a hint of satisfaction. And my final demand, Liam, is the most crucial for our potential future. She paused, letting the word potential hang in the air, a reminder that they were not reconciled. You will formally offer me the position of Chief Financial Strategist for your primary investment firm, Harrington Capital. This must be a salaried, equity-based position, reflecting my true value, with complete, autonomous authority over all risk assessment and compliance matters. You will sign a contract tomorrow that gives me the power to override any directive, even yours, if it poses a significant legal or financial risk. This will be a professional partnership, not a marriage based on your mother's approval. This was the ultimate power play, turning her supposed hobby into the foundation of his business and giving her the necessary power to prevent future compromises to his financial security and her professional standing. It was a complete reversal of their roles, transforming her from the tolerated wife to the essential, controlling partner. Liam didn't hesitate this time. He understood the necessity, the logic, and the poetic justice of the demand. Yes, he said simply. Prepare the contract. I will sign it. Elara finally allowed a slow, deep breath, the tension in her shoulders visibly easing. She capped her pen, placing it neatly back on the desk. Compliance is everything, Liam. If you execute these 3 terms completely and publicly, I will delay the divorce filing and consider the possibility of a professional partnership, which might lead to reconciliation. If you fail, the divorce proceeds, and the truth about your financial situation, including the near miss with the Singapore deal, will be made public. She was giving him a single, last chance, one based entirely on his actions, not his words. He walked over to the desk, his movements slow and deliberate, and reached for the notepad. He picked up the pen she had just used, the tip still warm, and wrote down the 3 points, committing them to memory and to paper. I understand the terms, Elara. Consider them executed. He looked up at her, a genuine, nakedly honest look of remorse in his eyes. You deserve this. And honestly, I need this. Thank you for not letting me completely destroy myself. The conversation was over, the groundwork for a brutal, but possibly transformative, future laid bare. He now had a monumental task ahead of him before sunrise. Liam didn't sleep. He spent the entire night at the antique mahogany desk, surrounded by the ghosts of his grandfather's ledgers, drafting and redrafting the necessary documents. He worked with a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years, the fear of losing Elara and the threat of ruin lending him a laser focus. He knew his mother would respond with fury, but for the first time, he found himself prioritizing his own integrity and Elara's demands over Victoria's approval. The public shaming had cost him his wife's respect, and only a public reckoning could begin to earn it back. At 5 a.m., he called his personal attorney and his financial consultant, waking them with non-negotiable instructions. The public statement about the cottage, a detailed, self-incriminating admission of his failure and Elara's brilliance, was the first priority. The termination documents for Victoria's roles were second. The new contract for Elara, drafted with unprecedented levels of authority, was third. He used Ilara's precise, technical language from the Singapore deal to ensure the legal documents were airtight, a final, humbling acknowledgement of her superior competence. By 8 a.m., the digital world began to move. The signed statement went out to all major financial and society publications. It was a brutal, self-inflicted blow, but it was honest. He explicitly named Ilara Maxwell Harrington, detailing the exact amount she saved him on the cottage and praising her unparalleled foresight and fiduciary responsibility. The statement ended with a clear declaration of her new role as Chief Financial Strategist at Harrington Capital, effective immediately, with a promise of absolute autonomy. Victoria's reaction was instantaneous and explosive. His phone began to ring with her private number, a terrifying, constant buzz he usually answered immediately. This time, he ignored it. He was dressed, shaved, and sitting at the kitchen island, drinking black coffee, waiting for the only communication that mattered. He knew he couldn't face her until Ilara's terms were fully met. He was shielding himself, preparing for the battle he should have fought years ago. At 9:30 a.m., Ilara walked into the kitchen, looking calm and professional, dressed in a sleek suit, ready for work. She did not look at him. Her eyes went straight to his phone, which was displaying the headline of a major financial news site. Harrington Air clears wife's name, cites her as new corporate strategist after structural fiasco. She read the headline, then the accompanying article detailing his self-confessed errors and her value. She looked up at Liam, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Adequate," she said, the single word a quiet, powerful acknowledgement of his compliance. He pushed a stack of signed documents across the island towards her. The termination papers for Victoria, drafted with brutal legal efficiency, and the new employment contract, complete with the authority override clause she demanded. "These are the next 2 terms. I'm delivering the termination papers to my mother in person at 10 a.m. Sign your contract, Ilara. Let's make it official." He was giving her the final piece of the power, placing the control of his life and his business directly into her hands. The sound of his condo's chime, loud and insistent, interrupted the moment. Liam and Ilara exchanged a knowing look. "It could only be one person. That's probably your first official task as my chief financial strategist," Liam said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Managing the risk of a hostile takeover from my vengeful mother." He stood up, his posture straight, no longer the terrified boy, but a man finally ready to face the consequences of his new, deliberate path. He was ready to fight for his life and the woman who had forced him to see the truth. Ilara picked up the contract, scanning the override clause one last time, a genuine, satisfied smile finally blooming on her face. "I'll be right behind you, Liam. But I suggest you let her get her initial fury out on you. You owe her that much for years of complicity." Her calm instruction was both a moment of support and a final, sharp reminder of his debt. She was ready to be his partner, but he had to take the first, hardest step alone. He knew then that the shame had been the catalyst for everything, the necessary rock bottom that had finally forced him to change. Liam opened the front door to find Victoria Harrington standing on the threshold, her face contorted in a mask of pure, incandescent rage that erased every trace of her usual poised composure. She was still dressed in her platinum gown, having clearly rushed straight from the mansion party or an early morning frantic gathering of her inner circle, her expensive clothes now looking disheveled, her immaculate hair slightly mussed. She held a printed copy of the financial news article, crumpled and shaking in her perfectly manicured hand, the headline screaming about her son's supposed structural fiasco. "What in God's name is the meaning of this, Liam?" she shrieked, her voice high and uncontrolled, a sound that rarely escaped her lips. She didn't wait for an answer, instead barreling past him into the foyer, her eyes searching for her true target. "That creature. She's poisoned you. This statement, it's a complete fabrication. You are making the Harringtons a laughingstock, admitting to a catastrophic error in the press. And giving her a position? after she tried to sabotage the cottage. Liam closed the door slowly, deliberately cutting off her escape and creating a necessary barrier between their private confrontation and the outside world. He stood tall, blocking her path, his voice calm and firm, a tone he had never used with her before. "Stop, Mother. This statement is entirely true. I made the error, Ilara saved the firm. She is not a creature, she is my wife and, as of this morning, my chief financial strategist. Her contract is signed, and her authority is absolute." Victoria actually recoiled, momentarily stunned by his composure and his defiance. "You can't be serious. You let her write her own contract? After she humiliated you, stormed out of my party, and showed her true, low-class colors? You are jeopardizing everything your father and I built because of some misguided attempt to placate a woman who clearly despises you." She took a sharp breath, her eyes blazing with fury. "And the cottage? You know I would never allow a structural flaw. She invented that to undermine me. She's a liar, a schemer, and she is destroying our legacy." Liam finally raised his hand, an authoritative gesture that silenced her instantly, a move he had never dared to make. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out the crisp, legally bound papers. "Mother, you are mistaken. The structural flaw was real, and it was in the original contract that you personally oversaw. Ilara's counsel saved me over $500,000 and prevented a collapse. But that is now irrelevant. What is relevant is this." He held out the stack of documents, the termination papers. "These documents formally revoke all your advisory and board positions within Harrington Capital and the family trust. Effective immediately. You will no longer have any oversight, access, or influence over my finances, my projects, or my marriage. Your judgment is flawed, your management is emotionally driven, and your presence is a consistent, unacceptable liability to my business. I will not tolerate it anymore." His words were cold, precise, and entirely devoid of the filial affection she had always weaponized against him. Victoria stared at the papers, her face slack with disbelief, the shock finally dissolving the rage. You can't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am your mother. I built this life for you. You are nothing without me, without my connections, my guidance." The shift from raging tyrant to desperate, cornered woman was complete, but Liam felt no pity, only a deep, weary sense of relief that the spell was finally broken. He realized her love was entirely conditional, based only on his obedience and his subservience to her will. "I am nothing without my integrity, Mother," he countered, the finality in his voice undeniable. "And you forced me to compromise it for years. I shamed my wife at your party, not because I believed your lie, but because I was a coward who feared your disapproval more than I valued her. That ends today. The family legacy will be rebuilt on competence and respect, not on your social manipulation." He placed the documents on a nearby table. "My lawyer will contact yours. Please leave. Now." The confrontation, the one he had dreaded his entire adult life, was over. Victoria stood there for another full minute, trembling, her eyes darting between her defiant son and the termination papers, before finally turning on her heel, her platinum dress rustling loudly as she marched out the door, defeated and silent. Liam watched her go, a weight lifting from his chest that he hadn't known he was carrying. He turned, leaning against the door, his eyes closed, exhausted, but completely, irrevocably free of her influence. He had finally made his choice, and the price, while high, felt worth every penny. The front door clicked shut behind Victoria. The sudden silence in the condo was immense, pregnant with the potential for a new beginning. Liam took a deep, shaky breath, allowing the raw, physical exhaustion of the confrontation to wash over him, and slowly turned to face the kitchen. Ilara was standing exactly where she had been, calmly sipping her coffee, observing the fallout, a silent judge in a black suit. Her expression was no longer cold, but it wasn't forgiving either. It was analytical, assessing his performance, judging whether he had truly severed the toxic cord. "You delivered," she said, nodding once, a small, yet profound gesture of acceptance. "The documents were comprehensive, and your delivery was unequivocal. You didn't leave any room for her to maneuver. That's the partnership I require, Liam, clarity and finality." Liam walked over to the island, pulled out a chair, and sat down opposite her, the exhaustion making his muscles feel like lead. "I meant every word, Ilara. Not just to her, but to myself. You were right about everything. My cowardice nearly cost me everything, and the fact that you protected me even as I shamed you is a debt I can never repay. I need you. Not just as a wife, but as the only person I trust with my business and my judgment." Ilara finally signed the contract, sliding the thick stack of papers across the counter to him, officially making herself the CFO, strategist, and ultimate authority on risk. "I'm not doing this for reconciliation, Liam. I'm doing this for self-preservation, and because I genuinely believe I can transform Harrington Capital into a stable, truly profitable entity. My partnership with you will be professional first. The emotional side? That will take time, a lot of work, and absolute, unwavering proof that you will never, ever prioritize anyone's approval over my well-being and my truth." "I understand," Liam replied, picking up the contract and tucking it into his briefcase with a sense of profound reverence. "I accept those terms. Starting today, we operate differently. Every major decision, every public appearance, every potential risk is vetted by you. No more secrets, no more appeasement. Our public life is a unified front, and our private life starts from a position of absolute equality. I will not just be your husband, I will be your ally and your biggest supporter, publicly and privately." She looked at him then, truly looking at him, and he saw a flicker of the genuine affection he had missed so desperately. "That's all I ever wanted, Liam. The recognition of my worth, not just as a person, but as the powerful, competent professional I am. Your mother tried to erase that, you helped her. Now, you have to help me rebuild it, starting with our firm and our social standing." She outlined a strategy to leverage the media attention from his public statement, turning the cottage fiasco into a brilliant narrative of corporate restructuring and leadership change, a masterclass in spin that he never would have conceived of on his own. The rest of the day was a blur of high-level meetings, legal filings, and strategic planning, all run by Ilara from the comfort of their kitchen island. Liam moved seamlessly into the role of obedient partner, presenting data, executing instructions, and watching with awe as she systematically dismantled and rebuilt his corporate structure with ruthless, efficient logic. She was spectacular, and the sight of her in her element, completely in control, was the most attractive thing he had ever witnessed. He realized that the woman he fell in love with was not the socialite he tried to make her into, but the force of nature he had tried to suppress. By the time the sun began to set, the Singapore deal was stable, Victoria was formally locked out, and Ilara Maxwell Harrington was legally and publicly the most powerful person in Harrington Capital, holding the financial reins firmly in her hand. The shame of the night before, the crushing humiliation he had inflicted, had been the necessary fire that purified their relationship, burning away the years of pretense and revealing the only path to survival. Liam sat back, exhausted but profoundly hopeful, looking at the woman who was now his partner, realizing he had exchanged a gilded cage for a future built on steel and integrity. 6 months later, the remnants of that catastrophic night at the Zenith felt like a distant, cautionary tale, occasionally whispered in the hallowed halls of Beverly Hills society. Liam and Ilara were still married, but the relationship they had built bore little resemblance to the fragile, suffocating union that had existed before. Their marriage was now a fortress built on mutual respect and professional necessity, fortified by Ilara's unassailable authority. They had moved out of the Brentwood condo, selling it to fund a new, smaller, custom-designed home in Malibu, a place where Victoria had no history, no claim, and no influence. Victoria's attempt at legal retaliation was swiftly and brutally quashed by Ilara's legal team, using the same financial documents Ilara had prepared for the Singapore deal. Victoria, realizing she was utterly outmaneuvered by the woman she called Taki, retreated entirely from the public eye, her social relevance eroding as quickly as her financial influence over Liam. Her attempts to reconcile with her son were met with polite, firm refusals, the price of his new freedom a permanent barrier to her control. Liam no longer feared her, he pitied her for the emptiness of a life built on judgment and manipulation. Ilara's role at Harrington Capital was a spectacular success. She streamlined operations, cut off several risky, emotionally driven ventures Liam had inherited, and secured 2 massive new international deals, transforming the firm from an unstable, vanity project into a robust, disciplined financial powerhouse. The very qualities Victoria had sneered at, her methodical approach, her cautious assessment of risk, her refusal to engage in speculative gambling, were now the foundations of Liam's wealth. He, in turn, was her fiercest defender and most loyal operative, learning to value substance over appearance, integrity over approval. Their personal relationship was slowly, painstakingly rebuilding. There was no sudden, dramatic reconciliation, but a steady, deliberate accumulation of trust. Liam never wavered in his commitment to her terms, consulting her on everything, respecting her privacy, and publicly acknowledging her every professional victory. He started leaving her small, meaningful notes, not expensive jewelry, but handwritten thanks for her brilliance, for her patience, and for saving him from himself. He had learned that the grand gestures of his former life meant nothing compared to the quiet, consistent reality of showing up for her, fully and honestly. One evening, as they stood on the terrace of their new Malibu home, watching the sunset over the Pacific, Ilara leaned her head against his shoulder, a small, intimate gesture that spoke volumes about her slowly thawing heart. "The only thing I regret about that night," she murmured softly, "is the gold-threaded dress. It didn't belong to me. It didn't reflect who I am." Liam wrapped his arm around her, holding her tightly. "I kept it," he admitted, a quiet confession. "It's in the basement, in a locked box. It's not a symbol of shame anymore, Ilara. It's a reminder. It's the artifact of the night I finally saw the true cost of my own weakness, and the moment I realized you were the only real, valuable asset I had. That night, I chose fear. Now, I choose you, every single day, without condition." Ilara took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his, a silent acknowledgement of his growth. The shaming had been brutal, public, and nearly fatal to their marriage, but Liam's regret, driven by financial necessity and then solidified by genuine remorse, had led to a transformation. He was a different man, she was a stronger woman, and the partnership they forged in the crucible of his failure was finally, genuinely, built to last. She realized that sometimes, the hardest truths are the only things capable of setting you free. The marriage was saved, not by love, but by the cold, clear light of power, respect, and regret. The humiliation had been the catalyst, the change was the resolution.